Welcome back to Secret Speaks. How has your day been? Now let's uncover the mystery hidden in today's story. On the day we buried my son, my daughter-in-law threw my suitcase into the rain and hissed that I had 3 days to disappear. She believed I was nothing but a shadow, yet in my hands I carried more than grief. I carried the deed to the house Daniel put in my name, proof of her affair in Cancun, while he lay dying the draft contract where she tried to sell his company for millions, and even the forged will she dared to file. Most of all, I carried Daniel's last whisper that she forced him to sign papers he did not trust. I am Evelyn Carter, and this is not a story of vanishing, but of truth that shattered every lie. Rain fell heavy on my shoulders as I stepped out onto the porch, my hands gripping the handle of my old suitcase. The cars from the funeral had already rolled away, leaving only streaks of wet tracks on the street. I felt hollow, as if the day had taken every ounce of strength I had left. Before I could carry the suitcase down the steps, Vanessa Moore pushed the door wide behind me, and her voice cut sharper than the rain. "You have 3 days to disappear." The words were like a knife across my skin. She did not shout. She never shouted. Her voice was calm, precise, the kind that left no space for argument. She pushed the suitcase from my hand, and it toppled onto the wet concrete with a thud, splattering my dress with mud. Her eyes held mine cold and steady, as if she were announcing a fact, rather than delivering an ultimatum. At that moment, I felt the neighbors' eyes on us. Mr. Allen from across the street lingered on his porch under his umbrella, shaking his head slowly, and his wife tugged at his arm to turn away. To them, I was only a burden left behind after my son's death, a woman who had outlived her place. I bent down and touched the handle of the suitcase, the leather slick with water, and steadied it upright. My fingers trembled, but not from the cold. Grief and rage tangled in my chest, pressing hard against my ribs. I wanted to shout back to tell her that this house was not hers, that Daniel had built his life with me long before she arrived. But the words caught in my throat. Instead, I stood tall, rain dripping from my hair into my eyes, and I simply looked at her. Vanessa crossed her arms, her black dress clinging to her figure, her pearls gleaming faintly in the stormlight. She looked like a widow out of a magazine spread, not a woman who had just buried her husband. There was no grief in her face, only satisfaction. She leaned slightly toward me, her chin high, as if daring me to argue. My silence seemed to please her. She turned, slammed the door behind her, and I heard the lock click into place. I stayed there a long moment, the sound of rain drowning out the quiet street. My shoes soaked through my fingers, numb against the handle. Every memory of Daniel flickered through my mind, from his first steps across the living room floor to his last words whispered in that hospital bed. Something is not right. He had been too weak to explain, his lips dry and trembling, but I heard him, and now I understood. I dragged the suitcase down the steps, each bump loud against the concrete. The streetlight at the corner flickered, casting the world in broken shadows. My car was parked half a block down, its windshield wipers lifted like arms reaching out. I set the suitcase against the trunk and leaned there, rainwater pooling at my feet. My chest heaved with breaths I could not steady. 3 days to disappear. I repeated the words under my breath, letting them roll around inside me. She thought she had ended me with that sentence, as if I were nothing more than a guest who had overstayed. She believed the neighbors would nod and agree that her polished presence at church and her careful words would erase me from my own son's story. But she had forgotten who Daniel was before she ever touched his life. He had been mine first. The door of the house remained closed, lights glowing warmly inside. I could almost hear Ethan's laughter echoing from the upstairs room where I once rocked him to sleep. He was only 7. What stories would he be told about me once I was gone? Would Vanessa teach him to see me as an intruder? The thought twisted my stomach until I nearly bent double on the curb. I opened the trunk and shoved the suitcase inside, slamming it shut harder than I needed to. The sound cracked through the rain, a gavel striking against stone. My reflection in the wet window looked old, worn, my hair plastered to my face, but there was something alive in my eyes I had not seen in months. Resolve. I climbed into the driver's seat, the fabric cold and damp beneath me, and gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned pale. The house loomed in the rearview mirror, standing tall as if it belonged to someone else now. I whispered to myself low and certain I will not disappear. The words steadied my breath. The engine started with a shudder. I pulled away slowly, the tires hissing against wet pavement. At the stop sign, I lingered too long, staring at the red glow reflected on the slick road until a horn blared behind me. I jolted forward, wiping at my eyes with the back of my hand. Each block stretched longer than the last, as if the city itself was testing how far I could carry my grief. At a small diner near the highway, its neon sign buzzing faintly, I pulled into the lot. Through the window, I saw people laughing over coffee waitresses, refilling cups, lives moving forward without pause. I sat in the car and watched my hands resting on the wheel, my heart heavy. That world felt unreachable. I thought of stepping inside, ordering pie like I had once done with Daniel after his soccer practices, but the memory was too sharp. It would only hollow me further. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass and closed my eyes. Vanessa's voice replayed again and again. You have 3 days to disappear. She believed grief could be scheduled, that a mother could be erased as easily as wiping chalk from a board. She believed that control was the same as ownership. She was wrong. When I opened my eyes, the rain had softened into mist, the traffic lights glowing in watery halos. I started the car once more and drove toward the apartment above the florist shop where I had lived these last few years. Each turn of the wheel tightened my grip, each mile carrying me further from the home I had once thought I would share with my grandchildren. At the narrow stairs, I hauled the suitcase up each step, creaking under the weight. Inside the apartment smelled faintly of roses from the shop below. I set the suitcase by the bed and sat beside it, staring at the blank wall. My hands folded in my lap, steady now, no longer trembling. The quiet pressed in, but instead of crushing me, it held me. 3 days. That was her timeline. But time did not belong to her. It belonged to me, to Daniel's memory, to Ethan's future. I whispered once more, I will not disappear, and in the stillness of that small room, the words sounded like the beginning of something that would not break. I carried the weight of her words back to the apartment that night, my shoes still soaked from the rain. I sat on the edge of the bed staring at the suitcase and thought of the long years that had brought me here. Memories came sharp and fast, not as comfort, but as reminders. I saw Daniel at 6 years old running through the yard with a baseball glove too big for his hand, his laughter filling the air like sunlight. He was mine alone back then, just a boy and his mother figuring out how to keep the lights on and the cupboards full. We lived in a small duplex in East Dallas. I taught English at the elementary school and took summer jobs cleaning classrooms. Daniel helped by mowing lawns, walking dogs, anything to bring in a little extra. I remember the day he sold his binder of baseball cards because one of my tires had split open. He pressed the $40 into my hand and said safety matters more than rookie cards. That boy carried responsibility far heavier than his years. When he was 22, he came home one evening with a used laptop under his arm and ideas pouring out of him faster than he could explain. He sketched diagrams on a whiteboard leaning against the wall, saying, "This piece talks to that one, and together they build something people will pay for." In 2014, he registered Cartersoft. He called me from the courthouse parking lot, laughing like the whole world had just opened. I told my students the next day to write about beginnings, and while they scribbled their stories, I wrote one line on my own paper: "Begin again." For a while, life truly felt like a beginning. Then came Vanessa. He met her at a charity run. She arrived at our apartment with flowers and questions about my classroom, and a smile that seemed warm. I wanted to believe her for his sake. At their wedding under oak trees strung with lights, I cried from hope, not fear. She held his hand like she would never let go. The change was slow, almost invisible at first. Phone calls that once came nightly slipped into quick texts. Visits that were once casual became scheduled. I baked a loaf of banana bread one Saturday and stopped by without calling. Vanessa opened the door only a crack and said the baby was resting and Daniel was busy. She smiled politely, but her words pressed against me like a closed door. I left the bread on the porch and drove home, telling myself not to take it personally. When Ethan was born, I stayed for 2 weeks rocking him through the night so they could rest. I thought it was a gift we shared, but when Vanessa's mother arrived, I was thanked and ushered out with a tote bag of granola and a candle. The warmth was gone as quickly as it had appeared. After that, every visit had to be approved. Too much stimulation, too many germs, too many rules. I watched my grandson through windows more than I held him in my arms. Daniel tried to keep balance, but his words changed. He began to speak of boundaries of protecting their peace words that sounded rehearsed, not his own. He would kiss my cheek quickly in the garage and whisper not to take it personally. He wanted peace, and she offered it by shutting out the noise, even when the noise was me. Caroline, my sister, saw what I tried to ignore. She worked as a nurse in Houston and had an eye for details. In 2020, she noticed company expenses that looked off. She circled them in red and asked me if Daniel had mentioned new vendors. He brushed her off gently, saying Vanessa handled much of the financial side so he could focus on the product. Caroline warned me to keep an eye out, but I stayed quiet. I didn't want to believe there was a reason to doubt. By the end of 2021, Daniel was thinner pale, complaining of exhaustion. He blamed the long hours at Cartersoft. When the diagnosis came in early 2022, it was like the floor dropped out from under me. Pancreatic cancer. Stage 4. Words no mother should ever hear. Vanessa gathered every document from the doctors and told me she would handle appointment schedules and updates. She said Daniel needed calm, not questions. Her composure was perfect practiced, and it frightened me. At Baylor University Medical Center, I brought a framed photo of Ethan and a quilt from home. The next day, both were gone. Vanessa said the staff must have moved them because too many personal items cluttered a room. I asked a night nurse about visiting hours, and she whispered that Vanessa had requested tighter restrictions. She told me not to take it personally that spouses often lead care decisions, but I did take it personally because it meant my son was fading while I was kept at arm's length. There were nights when Daniel was awake enough to see me. His eyes followed mine, glassy but aware. Once when Vanessa stepped into the hall to take a call, he moved his lips with effort. I leaned close, and I felt the faintest breath on my cheek as he whispered, "Something is not right." Those words burned into me. He closed his eyes before I could ask more, slipping back into a medicated fog. I held his hand cold but not lifeless, and promised myself I would not forget. The next morning I brought him a notebook and set it by the bed. I told him to write anything he wanted to remember. He nodded weakly and slid it under his pillow. When I came back that evening, it was gone. Vanessa said it must have been tossed with the linens. My stomach twisted. A man clinging to the edge of his life deserved to leave behind his own words. I searched the drawers quietly when she stepped out, but nothing remained. Caroline met me one evening in the parking garage. She squeezed my shoulder and said we need to write down what we see, every dosage, every visit, every odd request. Her eyes were steady, her voice certain. She told me sometimes the kindest face is just a mask. I knew who she meant. I nodded. Autumn sunlight filtered through hospital windows like stained glass, golden but cold. Daniel spoke less, slept more. Vanessa stood at the foot of the bed with a clipboard, her posture straight as if she belonged to the staff. She told the nurse that Daniel needed fewer visitors, then turned her gaze on me. I left quietly, but in the chapel downstairs, I pressed my hands to my knees and whispered the words he had given me. Something is not right. I carried those words back to my apartment each night, writing them in my own notebook, circling them over and over. They became a pulse beneath my grief, a reminder that silence was not the end. I told myself that one day I would have to prove him right, that what he whispered would be the key to everything. The days blurred together, heavy with loss, but that sentence lit a small fire inside me. It burned steady, a promise I could not ignore. I would remember, I would watch, and when the time came, I would bring his truth into the light. The hospital smelled of bleach and stale coffee, the kind of smell that settles in your throat and never leaves. I walked the long corridor toward Daniel's room, my shoes squeaking against the waxed floor, and told myself to breathe evenly. He had been more sedated the last few days, his eyes heavy, his voice reduced to whispers that barely reached me. I carried a thermos of chicken broth, hoping for one clear moment with him, one piece of connection that was ours alone. When I stepped inside, Vanessa stood at the foot of the bed with a clipboard pressed tight to her chest. She looked like she belonged to the staff, speaking in that measured voice that left no room for argument. She told the nurse that Daniel needed another dose, that he was restless in the night. The nurse hesitated, glancing at me. Vanessa's stare carried authority. She leaned closer, saying she had experience with pharmaceuticals, that she was making sure her husband was comfortable. The nurse adjusted the IV line without a word. Daniel barely stirred. His chest rose and fell in shallow rhythms. His lips parted, the corners of his mouth dry. I set the thermos down and touched his hand. It was warm but slack, and I wondered if he even felt my fingers. Vanessa looked at me and said he needed quiet. She suggested I come back later when he was stronger. I bit down on my reply and stayed seated. Caroline arrived after her shift. Her scrubs wrinkled her eyes sharp. She hugged me briefly, then moved straight to the chart hanging at the end of the bed. She studied the notes and her brow furrowed. Later in the hallway, she whispered that the dosage looked unusual, higher than what she had seen in similar cases. She pointed to an addition in the margin, the numbers written in a hand that looked careful but unfamiliar to the medical staff. Caroline said softly that it looked like Vanessa's handwriting. The thought made my stomach clench. I had watched Vanessa make grocery lists, party schedules, and notes on Ethan's school calendar. The rounded loops of her letters, the way she pressed hard into the paper, it was all too familiar. I asked Caroline if she was sure. She nodded once her jaw tight. She said she would not accuse without proof, but she advised me to watch closely to document everything I could. That evening, I lingered long after visiting hours. A sympathetic nurse let me stay, pulling the curtain half closed so I could sit in the chair near the window. The machines beeped in steady patterns, a cruel metronome of time slipping away. I watched Vanessa bend over the clipboard again, her pen moving across the page. My chest ached with anger, but I stayed silent, memorizing the shape of her movements. The next morning, Daniel opened his eyes for a few brief seconds. His gaze met mine, hazy but present. I bent close and whispered his name. His lips moved, trying to form words, but nothing came. I brushed his forehead and told him I was here. A shadow fell across us as Vanessa walked in carrying a paper bag. She smiled faintly, but her eyes held warning. She told me she had spoken with the doctors and that higher doses of morphine were necessary to ease his pain. She made it sound like kindness, but I saw how quickly he slipped under again, too deeply, too fast. Caroline returned the next evening with a small notebook. She pressed it into my hand and told me to write down everything. Times doses, changes in behavior, every odd instruction from Vanessa. She said that paper does not forget the way people do. Together we sat by Daniel's bed and took turns noting when the pumps clicked, when his eyelids fluttered, when Vanessa whispered to a nurse in the hallway. It felt like a secret war, quiet and desperate. One night near midnight, I walked into the room and found Vanessa adjusting the IV line herself. I froze in the doorway. She straightened and said she was only checking the connection. Her tone was smooth, calm, as if I were the one overreacting. I wanted to shout to call for the nurse, but fear held me still. Instead, I stepped closer to Daniel and placed my hand on his arm, whispering that I loved him, that I was here. He did not respond. His body lay still, caught in the weight of chemicals he never asked for. I began to notice patterns. Whenever Daniel seemed alert, Vanessa would find a reason to request another increase. If he managed to speak more than a sentence, she would insist he was in discomfort. The staff complied, trusting her calm explanations. I stood by helpless, knowing what was happening, but unable to prove it. One afternoon, I stepped out to the vending machine for a bottle of water. When I returned, Caroline was flipping through the chart, her lips pressed into a thin line. She showed me another margin note, the same looping handwriting. She whispered that Vanessa was steering his treatment. I felt the blood drain from my face. Caroline placed a steady hand on my shoulder and told me again to keep writing. She promised me the truth leaves traces even when people try to cover them. The days grew shorter, the light through the hospital windows turning gold. Daniel spoke less, slept longer. I sat beside him, holding his hand, whispering stories from his childhood. I told him about the baseball card money, about the night he called me from the parking lot after registering Cartersoft. His eyelids flickered as if somewhere inside he remembered. Vanessa stood at the doorway, listening, her expression unreadable. One evening, I leaned close and asked Daniel if he wanted me to call anyone, if there was something he needed me to do. His lips trembled, and for a brief second, I thought he would answer. Then his breathing slowed, his body sinking deeper into the haze. I pressed my forehead to his and whispered that I would not leave him, that I would carry whatever he could not. That night in my apartment, I spread Caroline's notebook across the table. The pages filled quickly, times and dosages lined up against my shaky handwriting. Each line was proof of something unseen, a record of the quiet theft of his voice. I traced my finger over the words, and felt the weight of responsibility settle heavy on my shoulders. Something was being stolen from my son, not just his health, but his chance to speak, to fight, to leave his truth behind. I understood now that the battle was not only against disease, it was against control, against silence, against a mask of care that hid something darker. I closed the notebook and set it beside my bed, whispering the same promise I had whispered to Daniel. I will not disappear. Neither will you. There were afternoons when I would drive across Dallas with a pot of stew or a basket of muffins, hoping for a few hours with Ethan. The first time I tried after Daniel's diagnosis, Vanessa opened the door only halfway and smiled with the sweetness she used when neighbors were watching. She said Ethan was overstimulated and that the doctor had recommended a strict schedule. She thanked me for the food, but kept her body angled as if to block me from entering. I stood there with my arms aching from the weight of the pot and said I would come back another time. As I walked back to my car, I heard her voice soften behind the closed door, calling Ethan darling, and my chest tightened until I could hardly breathe. Another day I parked in front of their house and saw Ethan's small head bobbing at the window. He waved his little hand, tapping against the glass. My heart lifted until Vanessa pulled the curtain sharply and the image disappeared. When she finally opened the door, she told me Ethan had homework, though he was only in the first grade, and that the afternoon was not a good time for visits. Her tone was polite, but her eyes carried a challenge. Behind me, Mrs. Allen from across the street watered her flowers and glanced over. I felt the heat rise to my face. I placed the bag of cookies into Vanessa's hands and said I hoped he would enjoy them. By the time I reached my car, Mrs. Allen was already shaking her head, and I knew the story she would repeat to others. Poor Evelyn, always dropping by uninvited, always making things difficult for her daughter-in-law. The hardest moments were the ones where the insult was quiet enough to pass as kindness. Once at Ethan's birthday party, I stood by the counter cutting cake while Vanessa made an announcement to the room about the importance of boundaries in family life. She smiled toward me and added that sometimes love can be overwhelming for a child. The parents in the room nodded sympathetically, and I felt my hands tighten around the knife. Ethan ran past me with frosting on his cheek laughing, but the sound could not reach the hollow in my chest. At church the following Sunday, Pastor Michael Green greeted me warmly in the entryway. He spoke of Vanessa with admiration, how she had taken on so much with Daniel sick, how she was a model of devotion. He told me the congregation planned to organize meals for her so she would not be stretched too thin. I thanked him, though the words stuck in my throat. I wanted to ask if anyone planned meals for the mother who sat alone at night writing notes in a notebook while her son slipped further away, but I only smiled, clutching my hymnal tighter. During the service, Vanessa sat in the front pew dressed in black, Ethan beside her in a pressed shirt and tie. She dabbed at her eyes during the sermon and bowed her head just long enough for others to notice. The women of the church whispered about her strength, about her sacrifice, and I sat 3 rows back with my hands folded invisible. Every time someone praised her, I felt myself shrinking. By the end of the service, I could hardly stand. Later, as people gathered in the fellowship hall, Pastor Green called her a pillar of grace. He thanked her for her donations to the food pantry, and the room applauded. I wanted to shout that those donations came from Carter Soft's accounts, that she was polishing her image with money Daniel had earned with sleepless nights and endless effort. But I stayed silent because I had nothing to hold in my hand, no proof that would not make me sound bitter. Caroline drove up the next weekend and found me sitting at the kitchen table staring at a cooling cup of coffee. She placed her bag down and asked what was wrong. I told her about the church, about the neighbors, about the looks that said I was clinging where I was not wanted. She listened, her face stern, then reached across the table and took my hand. She said that Vanessa was building walls out of appearances and that the only way through them was with evidence no one could deny. Caroline told me to keep my head down and keep writing. She said one day the notebook would matter. That night I opened it again, flipping through the pages filled with times and dosages, with notes about missing items from Daniel's room, with memories of Ethan pressed against glass. Each line felt like a lifeline. If the world saw Vanessa as a saint, then the only way to change the story was to show the truth written clear. The next Sunday at church, I arrived early and sat in the back pew. I watched Vanessa glide down the aisle holding Ethan's hand, smiling faintly at the congregation. People leaned toward her, some touching her arm, others whispering encouragement. Pastor Green greeted her as if she were royalty. She lowered her eyes modestly, but I knew the pride burning underneath. I prayed silently, not for patience, but for strength. Strength to wait, strength to endure, strength to gather what I needed. When the service ended, I slipped out before anyone could speak to me. In the parking lot, I leaned against my car, the sun warm on my face, and told myself the same truth again. Words and glances could wound, but they could not erase records. They could not erase paper. They could not erase Daniel's voice when he whispered that something was not right. The humiliation pressed on me from every side, but beneath it, I felt the steady weight of resolve. I would not let myself be silenced by whispers or by applause given to the wrong person. Only proof could speak louder than Vanessa's polished lies, and I knew now that gathering it was the only way forward. I left the church parking lot with my jaw clenched and drove straight to my apartment above the florist. The hallway smelled like damp cardboard and roses. I unlocked my door, set my purse on the counter, and went to the closet where I kept a stack of plastic tubs and one battered file box Daniel had handed me years ago. He had said back then that I was better at keeping things safe. I slid the box onto the table and peeled back the brittle tape. The lid gave with a soft sigh, and a wave of paper dust rose like breath. Inside were neat manila folders in Daniel's block letters. Insurance, taxes, lease. I thumbed through until my fingers landed on one word that tightened my chest. House. I drew the folder out and spread the contents under the lamp. On top lay a copy of a warranty deed stamped by Travis County in heavy ink. Beneath it, a survivorship agreement, the notary seal pressed deep enough to feel with a fingertip. I traced the circle as if it were a compass and read every line twice. The deed was dated in 2016. It named Daniel Carter and Evelyn Carter as joint tenants with rights of survivorship. It listed the legal description of the Austin property Daniel had bought when Carter Soft first began to stand on its own. The survivorship agreement said what I needed it to say. If one of us died, the other took full title by operation of law. No room for anyone to wedge themselves between intention and ownership. My hands shook not from fear, but from the release that comes when the ground stops tilting. I set both documents into a clean sleeve and opened my laptop. The number for the Travis County Clerk's office took 3 clicks to find and 5 minutes of menus to reach a person. When a woman finally answered, I gave her our names, the recording numbers, and asked her to confirm the filings and check for any transfer to Vanessa Moore. I listened to the soft rattle of a keyboard and the rustle of papers. She said the deed had recorded in late May of 2016 and the survivorship agreement moments after. She said there was no subsequent deed to Vanessa or any related party. If someone claimed there was, I could order certified searches and copies. Her tone was ordinary, but the words steadied something inside me that had been shaking for months. I wrote her name and the time in Caroline's notebook and underlined the phrase "no transfer recorded." I printed the deed and the survivorship agreement from the scanned copies and slipped them behind the plastic. Holding that sleeve up to the light felt like holding Daniel's hand. He had looked ahead for me. He had given me more than comfort. He had given me a tool. Caroline picked up on the first ring. I told her I needed her eyes. She drove up after her shift hair pulled into a losing battle with a clip knuckles red from hospital soap. At my table, she read line by line, tapped the seal with a nail, and nodded once slow and certain. "Survivorship is clear," she said. "We will order certified copies, start a title search, and get a probate attorney ready in Dallas in case Vanessa tries anything." She sorted the papers into neat stacks and labeled them with a pen. Originals, working set, court set. She told me to put the originals somewhere fireproof. I knelt by the small safe under my bed and slid the sleeve inside. The dial clicked, and for the first time in weeks, I exhaled without shaking. We called the clerk again together. I ordered certified copies and confirmed spelling and mailing address. Caroline brewed tea while I repeated the recording numbers back to the clerk and thanked her. When I hung up, Caroline hugged me quick and hard. "Daniel did right by you." I could not find words, so I nodded and stared at the lamplight turning the edges of the papers gold. Memory rose clean and sharp. The day we signed those documents, a bank notary sat at my kitchen table with a traveling stamp and a leather pouch of forms. Daniel had joked that he was finally putting my name on something more romantic than the phone bill. I had teased that I would hang a brass plaque, and he had said, "Make it sparkle." The way he smiled then lives in the space behind my ribs, practical and tender at once. We made a list. Certified copies expected in the mail. Request a 10-year title search from a local company. Meet a probate lawyer to map worst-case scenarios. Keep logging every call and every fact in the notebook. The act of writing made my hands steady. Each bullet point felt like a rung on a ladder that reached back toward solid ground. When Caroline left, I stood by the window watching the street lamps blink on. The florist below shut off the cooler and the shop went quiet. I poured fresh coffee and set the working copies of the deed and agreement in a new binder. Touching the seal again, I realized the paper did more than secure a house. It testified that Daniel knew life could turn and that he had made a plan for that turn. He had not left me at the mercy of someone else's story. Vanessa's rainy sentence replayed in my head. 3 days to disappear. I heard it now as theater. The timeline she tried to hand me was only noise against the fact of ink and law. I pictured placing the deed on her kitchen island and speaking in the same measured tone she used on nurses. "You do not own what you think you own." The image did not bring glee. It brought calm. Truth does not shout. The next morning, I walked to the florist for coffee and told the owner I had paperwork to sort. She handed me a cup and squeezed my forearm, the kind of small kindness that keeps a spine straight. Back upstairs, I opened the safe only long enough to be sure the originals were exactly where I left them. I checked the binder, wrote a clean cover sheet, and slid Caroline's notebook beside it. I called a title company in Austin and ordered a full search. The clerk on that line asked for names and addresses and promised results within a week. I added the date to my notes and drew a small square beside it to tick when the packet arrived. Then I searched for a probate attorney in Dallas and left a message for Robert Walker, a friend of a friend Caroline trusted. I said I needed a short consultation about a survivorship deed and the risk of interference from a surviving spouse. I kept my voice even and short and saved details for when I had a live person listening. The afternoon stretched quiet and useful. I took photos of the recorded pages and emailed them to a new address I created for legal matters so I would not lose track. I wrote a file name convention on a sticky note so everything would match. Date, document, version. It felt like laying out bricks for a path. Not glamorous, not loud, but steady. By early evening, a soft rain began again and drummed on the metal stairs outside. I sat at the table and opened the binder to the first page. Deed recorded in 2016. Survivorship agreement in place. No transfer recorded to Vanessa. I read each line out loud, slow like prayer. Then I closed the binder and rested both hands on the cover. This was the first wall. There would be more to build more pieces to gather, but this one stood firm. I stood and stretched and walked to the window. The streetlights made small halos on the wet asphalt. Somewhere a car door shut and a couple laughed as they hurried into the restaurant at the end of the block. Life kept moving. Inside my apartment, life moved too, not as grief had moved me in circles, but as purpose moves a body forward. I washed my cup and set it to dry. I looked at the safe once more and felt nothing but quiet. Night settled around the building. I wrote one last line in the notebook before bed. He left me a foundation, and I intend to stand on it. Then I turned off the lamp and let the room go dark, knowing that when morning came, I would pick up the binder and the phone and keep going. I woke the next morning with more clarity than I had felt in months. The deed and survivorship agreement were not just scraps of paper. They were the anchor Daniel had left for me, and I knew I needed guidance to use them properly. Caroline had once mentioned a probate attorney she trusted in Dallas. His name was Robert Walker. I dialed his number with shaking hands, half afraid he would dismiss me the way so many others had. Instead, his voice was steady, warm, but businesslike, and he offered to see me that very afternoon. His office sat across from the courthouse in a weathered brick building. Inside shelves lined with law books gave off the smell of leather and dust. I laid the deed and survivorship agreement on his desk, telling him briefly about Daniel, about Vanessa, about the ultimatum. He read each line carefully, tracing the embossed seal with one fingertip. Then he leaned back and said in plain words that the deed was solid, the survivorship agreement airtight, and that the house was mine by law from the moment Daniel passed. He warned that intimidation was not ownership, and that if Vanessa tried to challenge it, she would face a wall of statute. He recommended ordering certified copies, filing a notice of interest at the county, and keeping meticulous records of any threats or actions. His calm transformed my fear into steps I could take. Outside on the sidewalk, I called Janet Cole, a friend I had not seen in years, but one I trusted. She had built her life as an investigative reporter, chasing stories people wanted buried. We met in a small cafe near downtown. She listened without interruption as I described Vanessa's polished act, the church donations that seemed too generous for her personal means, and the financial unease Caroline had spotted. Janet asked sharp questions, noting dates, names, and amounts. She said image was just costume, and behind every costume was a closet full of evidence. She agreed to dig into Carter Soft's records church donations and any property filings tied to Vanessa. She asked me to set up a clean email account so nothing got lost. Watching her write lists in her notebook, I felt the relief of having an ally who didn't flinch at ugly details. Later that evening, Rob called again saying he wanted me to connect with a retired cop turned investigator he trusted, Frank Delgado. We met in a quiet diner off the highway. He arrived in a plain suit, carrying only a small notebook. His questions were direct. What did I know about Jason Miller? When had I last seen them together? I told him Jason was Vanessa's trainer at a gym near White Rock Lake, that whispers of an affair had followed them, and that Cancun in 2023 was always at the edge of rumor. I showed him a photo from Ethan's birthday, where Jason stood just inside the frame smiling too freely. Frank studied it with the eyes of a man who had spent years noticing details no one else did. He said he would begin with surveillance at the gym and watch for patterns. He promised to keep everything legal and daylight ready. Back home, Caroline came over, still in her scrub's dark circles under her eyes from a double shift. She spread out papers on my table and pointed at expense codes from Cartersoft's accounts she had managed to see years before. Vendor codes for hospitality charges that looked like travel or wellness clubs. She had flagged initials VM on cards that did not belong to Daniel. She told me not to jump to conclusions, but to be patient. Patterns had to be proven. We agreed she would keep pulling what she could while I focused on gathering outside help. That night, the four of us scattered across Dallas formed a plan. Rob would prepare filings to secure my claim to the house. Janet would request public records starting with nonprofit audits and state filings. Frank would watch Jason and note any connection to Vanessa. Caroline would map suspicious charges and estimate what should have been normal spending. I would write everything down and stay quiet because silence and patience were my best weapons. The following day, Frank called. His voice was low cicadas, buzzing loud in the background. He had followed Jason at the gym and watched Vanessa arrive through a side door. They spent almost an hour in a private office, then left separately, meeting later at a smoothie shop where their gestures made it clear they were planning travel. He said he would pull flight records around March last year. I wrote every detail into the notebook. An hour later, Janet texted a photo of the church bulletin board. Vanessa's name appeared in large donations timed suspiciously close to Cartersoft's quarterly closings. Janet had already scheduled a call with a nonprofit auditor. She also discovered a condo near the gym tied to a shell company sharing an address with a Cartersoft vendor. She said it could be coincidence, or it could be where the costume was stored. Rob sent me a draft of the notice he would file with the county to make my interest official. He told me not to confront Vanessa yet. Let the records speak first. His words steadied me. Law was slow but strong. Caroline drove up that weekend with sandwiches and a box of sticky notes. We covered my table with them, drawing arrows between names and numbers. She reminded me that feelings were not facts, but facts were piling up. She told me Daniel would be proud I was choosing to fight with paper and patience. I held the binder against my chest and felt my pulse calm. When the night came quiet at last, I sat alone with the lamp low, the binder open to the first tab. Deed survivorship allies forming around me. For the first time since Vanessa's sentence in the rain, I felt less like a woman pushed to the edge and more like a mother standing firm. I turned off the light knowing tomorrow would bring more work, more calls, more pieces of the puzzle. But now I was not alone. The first call came from Janet on a Tuesday morning while I was folding laundry. Her voice was quick the way it always was when she had a lead. She told me to check my email. I set the basket down and opened my laptop. The subject line was simple: Cancun. My hands trembled as I clicked. The first photograph filled the screen. Vanessa in a sundress, her hair pulled back with a scarf, standing on a white sand beach. Jason Miller beside her shirt, unbuttoned hand resting low on her back. both smiling relaxed, oblivious to anything but each other. The timestamp in the corner read March 2023. That was the month Daniel lay in a hospital bed fighting for his life. I scrolled through the files, each one heavier than the last. Them at an open-air restaurant leaning close over cocktails. Them walking hand in hand through a resort lobby. Them by a pool, Vanessa's head on his shoulder. There was no mistaking the intimacy, no mistaking the setting. I pressed my fist to my mouth to keep from crying out. The room blurred until I wiped my sleeve across my eyes. Janet had written a note beneath the attachments. Source confirmed resort staff saw them together. Checking payment trail. More soon. The next call was from Frank that evening. He said he had pulled flight data. Both Vanessa and Jason boarded flights from Dallas to Cancun, within 30 minutes of each other, same airline, March 12th. They returned March 17th, same plane, seated 2 rows apart. He had copies of boarding passes tied to their frequent flyer numbers. He also traced a hotel bill charged to Carter Soft's corporate card, the one Daniel once used for business trips. The statement showed 5 nights at a luxury resort, meals and spa services, total over $6,000. My chest burned as he read each item aloud. I asked Frank to send copies. 10 minutes later, they landed in my inbox. I printed them and spread them across the table beside Janet's photographs. Together, they told a story that left no room for doubt. While Daniel was sedated, his wife and her trainer spent 5 days in paradise on his company's dime. I sat at the table and covered my face with my hands. For a long time, there was no sound except the hum of the refrigerator. Grief broke through me in waves sharp and deep, as if I were mourning all over again. I whispered Daniel's name and begged forgiveness for not protecting him from this betrayal. Tears dripped onto the photographs until I pushed them away to keep from smudging the ink. When the sobs eased, rage came hot and steady. I gathered the pages into a neat stack and pressed them into a clear sleeve. The plastic crinkled under my hands. Proof. It was no longer suspicion or whispered rumors. It was written down, documented, undeniable. Caroline arrived after her shift hair still damp from a hurried shower. She found me at the table with red eyes. I slid the folder toward her. She opened it slowly and stared at the photographs. Her jaw set hard. Then she looked at the receipts, her nurse's eyes catching every detail, every date. She said in a low voice that Daniel had been admitted for inpatient care on March 10th, that his vitals had been unstable that whole week. She pressed the receipts flat and shook her head. We sat in silence until Caroline placed her hand over mine. She said this was the beginning of something bigger, that paper like this carries weight in courtrooms. I nodded but could not speak. The betrayal was still raw, too sharp to frame as strategy yet. Later that night, Janet called again. She had traced the credit card trail further. The Carter Soft account used for the resort had been authorized by a new signatory, Vanessa's initials. That card should have been locked while Daniel was in treatment, but Vanessa had gained access somehow. Janet promised to keep digging for how she had obtained authority. I thanked her, though the words came out hoarse. After I hung up, I carried the folder to the safe under my bed and set it beside the deed. 2 anchors, 2 pieces of Daniel's legacy shielded from lies. I turned the dial and heard the lock click home. Sleep did not come easily. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw Vanessa laughing in the sun, Jason's arm around her, while Daniel lay alone under fluorescent lights. I forced myself to breathe slowly to remind myself that grief and fury could not undo what had happened. But proof could change what came next. Proof could turn whispers into judgment. In the morning, I called Rob. I told him I had photographs, flight records, and receipts. He told me to keep them secure and make 2 copies, one for his files, one for my working binder. He said adultery paired with misuse of company funds was not just scandal, it was leverage in probate and custody in every arena where Vanessa tried to play saint. His words steadied me. He told me to deliver the copies when we met next week. I spent the afternoon preparing the binder. I made a new section labeled Cancun. Into it went the photographs, the boarding passes, the hotel bill, and Janet's notes. I used red tabs to mark them. Each page felt like a brick in a wall I was building, one that Vanessa could not climb over with charm or lies. Caroline called that evening to check on me. I told her I was tired but steady. She reminded me again to write everything down, every call, every document. She said memory falters under pressure, but paper does not. After we hung up, I opened the notebook and wrote the date, the details, and one line that cut deep. While Daniel fought for life, Vanessa bought cocktails by the pool. The apartment was quiet, the street outside humming with ordinary life. I looked at the binder at the section marked Cancun and felt both hollow and strong. The betrayal had become fact, black and white, no longer hidden. The question now was how to use it and when. I turned off the lamp, letting the room sink into darkness, holding on to the weight of proof resting in the safe below me. Caroline showed up at my apartment just after sunrise, her scrubs still wrinkled from the night shift, and her hair pulled back in a clip that had nearly given up. She dropped her bag by the door and went straight to the table where my binder lay open. She looked like she was carrying something heavy inside her. Without speaking, she pulled a folder from her bag and spread several pages across the wood. She said she had been digging through old drives and connections, following the trail of Cartersoft's finances. Her voice was low, but certain when she told me she had found something that couldn't wait. I leaned forward and read the first page. My stomach twisted before my eyes even reached the bottom line. It was a draft purchase agreement for Cartersoft. The number at the top made my hands tighten on the paper. $3.2 million. The buyer was a small private firm with an office listed in Dallas, and there it was in black letters that felt like acid against my skin. The signatory for Cartersoft was not Daniel. It was Vanessa Moore with the title Interim CEO typed beneath her name. The place for disbursement of proceeds was not a company account. It was a personal account ending in numbers I had never seen. Caroline tapped the line with her nail, her eyes sharp. She said it was not in the company records Daniel had shared with her years ago. She had checked. None of the account numbers matched legitimate Cartersoft accounts. This was Vanessa's. My breath caught in my chest. I read the signature block again and again. It was her hand. She had written her name where Daniel should have been assuming authority that was never hers. As my eyes scanned the words, I heard Daniel's voice from the hospital bed. He had whispered once that she had made him sign something he did not trust. I had thought it was a medical form, maybe a will. Now the pieces slid into place. The memory of his hand gripping mine, his voice ragged with fear, collided with the document in front of me. It was not only his life she had tried to control, it was his work, his legacy, everything he had built from nothing. Caroline showed me screenshots she had taken of the file's metadata. The draft had been created in late April of 2023 and last modified 2 weeks later. The author field listed a generic profile. File path on the computer contained initials that matched Vanessa's. The evidence was there buried in the details. Caroline saved copies on a flash drive and in a secure folder. She had worked enough malpractice cases to know courts respect a digital trail. I sat back trying to breathe. The betrayal had a new face now. It wasn't just about a trip to Cancun or whispered lies. It was theft in progress. I could almost see her rehearsing the pitch painting herself as the grieving widow selling the company to keep her family afloat. And then I thought of Ethan. What story would she tell him when she sat at the dinner table with $3 million stolen from his father's name? The rage inside me burned steadier than grief. I called Rob immediately. He answered with the calm voice of someone used to bad news arriving before breakfast. I told him we had a draft agreement showing Vanessa as interim CEO, authorizing the sale of Cartersoft, and directing funds to her personal account. He told me to scan and send everything right away, then bring the originals to his office. He used words that made the room steadier. This is fraud. This is grounds for emergency relief. Caroline and I drove to Dallas that afternoon, the binder buckled into the back seat like a passenger. Rob met us in his office and spread the papers across his desk. He read each line in silence, underlining and circling with a black pen. He asked Caroline about the file properties, about the initials in the path, about the dates. She answered with the certainty of a nurse reading a chart. Then Rob looked at me and said he would prepare a petition for a temporary restraining order. He explained that it could freeze any attempt to transfer ownership or funds until a judge could weigh the evidence. He would also ask the court to bar Vanessa from presenting herself as an officer of the company and to preserve all records. His words carried weight. They turned my shaking fear into tasks. He asked me to sign an affidavit, plain and factual, stating what Daniel had whispered to me and what we had now discovered. I signed with a hand that felt stronger than it had in months. Later that evening, Janet called. She had been chasing the buyer listed in the draft. The firm had a history of acquiring struggling tech companies at bargain prices, flipping them quickly for profit. She told me 2 of its principals had ties to a consultant Vanessa had met at a conference years before. The timeline fit too neatly. Janet promised to keep pulling at the threads. She said if the deal had advanced even one step, there would be emails, maybe wire instructions. She would find them. Frank checked in from his surveillance. He told me he had seen Vanessa meet one of the buyer's executives at a downtown hotel lounge. Their conversation was short but familiar with gestures that suggested prior dealings. He didn't approach, but he logged every detail. The time, the place, the way she held her phone flat on the table as if ready to show something. He said if testimony was needed, he would swear to what he saw. Back at my apartment, Caroline and I created a new tab in the binder labeled Sale Attempt. We placed the draft agreement, the metadata screenshots, and Janet's notes inside. We printed on heavy paper, careful with staples and page order. We added a 1-page summary for Rob, laying out the facts in bullet form. The binder felt heavier when I closed it, as if each page added more gravity to the truth. As the night deepened, I sat alone at the table and thought of Daniel. I saw him as he had been when Cartersoft was just an idea, scribbling boxes on a whiteboard and grinning like he had cracked a code no one else could see. He had built something honest with his own hands. To see it reduced to a signature forged by a woman who had betrayed him was almost unbearable. But the anger sharpened into resolve. I walked to the safe and placed the originals inside. The dial clicked into place. The room was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the steady beat of my own heart. I knew the battle was only beginning. But now I had more than grief. I had proof that she was not just cruel. She was criminal. And proof is the one thing even Vanessa could not charm away. I turned off the lamp and stood by the window, watching the street below empty into silence. Somewhere out there, she was plotting her next move, confident in her mask. But in my hands now was the evidence Daniel had hinted at with his last whispered warning. She had forced him to sign something. He had not trusted it, and he had been right. Rob called me into his office on a gray morning when the courthouse square felt heavy with spring rain. His voice was clipped, not cold, but deliberate. He slid a folder across the desk toward me and told me to look. Inside was a will dated April 2023. My breath caught as I read the lines. It left everything, every account, every asset, every interest in Carter Soft to Vanessa Moore. Not a word about Ethan, not a line about me. The language was broad, sweeping, greedy. My son's name was only ink in the introduction and a shaky signature at the end. I gripped the paper until it bent under my hand. Daniel would never have signed this. He had whispered his doubt, his fear, and here it was. Rob leaned forward and said we needed patience. Forgery cases move with slow precision. He had already sent copies to a handwriting examiner and to the state office that tracks notary commissions. He warned me not to confront Vanessa yet. He said the law likes evidence more than emotion. I nodded, though every part of me screamed for confrontation. 6 weeks passed like a long bruise. I filled the time writing in Caroline's notebook, adding each strange look, each rumor whispered in the neighborhood. Janet kept feeding me small discoveries. A notary stamp on the will that belonged to a man Jason knew from the gym. That man had reported his stamp stolen 3 months earlier. She also found one of the supposed witnesses listed on the document, a woman named Kelly who in April had been working double shifts at a distribution center outside Fort Worth. Janet drove there herself, spoke to her manager, and got a copy of the schedule. Kelly had not been anywhere near the hospital where the will was supposedly signed. When the examiner's report finally came back, Rob called me immediately. His voice carried a note of satisfaction. The signature on the April will was not Daniel's. It was drawn, not written, each stroke lacking the pressure and rhythm of his true hand. The comparison sheets showed Daniel's authentic signatures on earlier contracts and the shaky counterfeit side by side. Even my untrained eyes could see the lie. Rob said the examiner was willing to testify under oath. I sat in his office again and ran my finger over the fake signature. My stomach knotted. To see my son's name twisted into a weapon against me made me feel both hollow and furious. Caroline was there with me. She pressed her hand to mine and said this was the proof we had been waiting for. It was not gossip. It was fraud, black and white. Rob outlined what came next. He would petition to have the will declared void. He would present the examiner's testimony, the stolen notary stamp report, and the time records proving the witness could not have been present. He would argue that the true documents, the 2016 deed and survivorship agreement, were the only valid instruments. He looked at me and said with quiet certainty that the court would not look kindly on this chain of lies. At night, I replayed Daniel's words in my head. She made me sign something I did not trust. I had thought it might be about his care. Now I understood he had been warning me about more. His suspicion had become my shield. Janet kept digging even after the examiner's report. She found that the second witness listed on the will was Jason's cousin, a man with a record for petty fraud and a habit of disappearing when questions got close. The name alone would not hold in court. Combined with the stolen notary stamp and the absent first witness, it painted a picture no judge could ignore. One evening, Rob called to confirm that the county had scheduled a hearing date. He sounded almost relieved, as if the pieces were finally aligning. He asked me to prepare myself for a fight. He said Vanessa would come armed with performance tears and polished words, but that none of it could erase the chain of evidence. He told me to keep quiet until the day came to let the facts speak first. I walked home through the drizzle that evening, binder heavy in my bag. I laid everything out on the table once more. The deed, the survivorship agreement, the Cancun receipts, the draft sale contract, and now the forged will with the examiner's report clipped to it. The papers looked ordinary, just ink and paper, but together they told the story of a woman who had crossed every line, who had stolen not only my son's peace, but also his voice. I sat in the dim light, hands flat on the table, breathing slowly. The rage had steadied into something stronger, something sharper. Vanessa's mask of devotion had cracked. She had thought no one would check the stamp, or the witnesses, or the shaky pen strokes. She had thought grief would blind me. But she was wrong. When I finally slid the forged will into a new tab of the binder, I wrote one word on the divider: fraud. Then I locked the binder in the safe beneath my bed and turned the dial. The click of the lock echoed like a promise in the quiet apartment. I decided the confrontation had to happen on my ground. I called Caroline, then Rob, then Janet, and told them I was hosting dinner at my apartment that Friday. I wanted witnesses, not just allies. I cooked all day, letting the familiar rhythm of chopping onions and stirring pots settle my nerves. By evening, the table was set with plain plates, and the binder waited on a chair beside me. The knock came exactly at 7. Vanessa stood in the doorway with Ethan's hand in hers. She wore a soft gray dress and a strand of pearls that glowed in the light. Her face was touched with powder eyes, reddened just enough to suggest recent tears. She hugged Ethan close as if to remind us all she was the grieving widow doing her best. Caroline took Ethan to the living room where the television was already set to a cartoon channel. Rob and Janet greeted Vanessa politely. The performance began. She sighed as she sat smoothing her skirt and thanked me for inviting her. She spoke about loneliness, about how hard it had been to manage the affairs Daniel left behind. Her voice quivered just enough to seem fragile. She glanced around the table, waiting for sympathy. I kept my hand steady on my lap and let her finish. Dinner began quietly. Forks scraped against plates, small talk fluttered and fell. Then I reached down and lifted the binder onto the table. The sound of the cover opening cut through the silence. I laid the first page in front of her. It was the deed from 2016 showing Daniel and me as joint tenants with rights of survivorship. Her eyes flickered. She tried to smile and said she knew Daniel had wanted me to feel secure. Rob cleared his throat and said the deed meant I owned the house outright. Her jaw tightened. I slid the next set of pages across. Photographs from Cancun, receipts from the resort boarding passes with her name beside Jason's. Janet's voice carried the facts like a reporter reading into a microphone. Vanessa's hands froze on the tablecloth. She whispered that the pictures must have been altered, that she had gone there with friends to clear her mind. Frank's notes in Janet's folder proved otherwise. Rob said quietly that corporate funds had paid for the trip. Her mask cracked slightly. The third document was the draft sale agreement for Carter Soft. Her name typed beneath the title, Interim CEO, her signature on the line. The disbursement account listed as her own. Caroline's eyes never left her face as she explained how the file metadata traced back to Vanessa's computer. Vanessa pushed her chair back an inch and hissed that she had been trying to protect the company. She claimed Daniel had wanted her to lead. Rob's calm voice reminded her that a probate judge would see fraud where she saw justification. Then came the forged will, the April 2023 version, leaving everything to her. I placed it down gently beside the handwriting examiner's report and the notice about the stolen notary stamp. Janet added the work records showing the listed witness had been on a shift 50 miles away at the time. Vanessa's face paled. She reached for the papers with shaking fingers, then shoved them back toward me. She insisted Daniel had signed willingly. Rob said firmly that experts had concluded otherwise. Finally, I drew out the note from Daniel's phone, the unfinished draft he had never sent. Vanessa is making me sign papers I do not trust. I read the words aloud, my voice unsteady but clear. The room went utterly still. For the first time, Vanessa's composure cracked completely. Her lips trembled. Her eyes darted toward the hallway where Ethan sat in the glow of the television. She whispered that Daniel had been confused that illness had clouded his mind. But the words rang hollow against the evidence stacked before her. She tried one last act of defiance. She raised her chin and threatened to sue me, to drag me through court until I had nothing left. Rob leaned forward and said evenly that a lawsuit would open every one of these documents to discovery that perjury and fraud carry prison sentences. The color drained from her face. She clutched at her pearls as if they might hold her steady, but her shoulders sagged. Tears came then, sudden and heavy. She pressed her hands to her eyes and began to sob loud and broken. The performance was gone. What sat across from me was not a widow cloaked in dignity, but a woman caught in her own lies. Caroline looked at me with quiet resolve. Janet scribbled notes as if to capture the moment. Rob sat back satisfied that the mask had finally dropped. The sound carried down the hall. Neighbors later told me they heard it through the walls. By morning, whispers had already spread. The perfect widow who had filled pews with sympathy was now a figure of suspicion. The church bulletin with her generous donations looked different in the eyes of those who read it. At that table under the dim light of my small apartment, the story she had written for herself cracked wide open. I gathered the documents back into the binder page by page, each one a stone set into a foundation. Vanessa stayed hunched in her chair, her sobs fading to quiet hiccups. For a long time, no one moved. The meal lay forgotten plates, cold. My hands steadied as I closed the binder and slid it back to the chair beside me. I breathed slowly, letting the silence hold. The evidence had spoken. Nothing else needed to be said. The courthouse in Dallas smelled of polish and paper when I walked through its doors in January of 2025. My palms were damp against the binder I held, the same binder that had followed me through nights of doubt and days of planning. Caroline walked beside me, her chin high, and Rob guided us through security with the calm of a man who had stood in these halls his whole life. Janet had already taken her seat near the back with her notepad ready to watch as a reporter and as a friend. Inside the probate courtroom, the air felt charged as if the walls themselves held their breath. Vanessa sat at the opposite table dressed in black again, her hair pulled into a neat twist, eyes rimmed in red. She leaned close to her attorney, whispering furiously. Jason was not there, though his shadow seemed to hover over her. I sat at our table, hands folded tight, staring straight ahead. The judge entered and we rose. Rob opened with the deed from 2016, the survivorship agreement stamped by Travis County. He placed certified copies before the judge and spoke with calm authority. He explained that title had vested in me immediately upon Daniel's death, that the deed was clean recorded and untouched by later transfers. Vanessa's attorney objected, claiming Daniel had intended his wife to inherit, but Rob pointed to the law. Intention without record is nothing. Record is what governs. Next came the forged will. Rob laid out the examiner's report. The stolen notary stamped the absent witness working miles away that day. He held up affidavits and schedules, letting each piece of evidence land like a stone in still water. The judge read quietly, lips pressed thin. Vanessa shifted in her seat, fingers twisting the pearls at her throat. Her attorney argued the signature was Daniel's shaky hand in his final days. Rob countered with expert testimony, a chart showing authentic signatures against the forged one. The difference was clear even to untrained eyes. Caroline took the stand next. Her nurse's uniform gave her an air of quiet authority. She testified about the medications, about Vanessa insisting on higher doses, about notes in the chart written in a hand that was not a nurse's. A physician followed, confirming that interference from a family member had raised concerns, though proof was difficult at the time. Caroline's voice never wavered. She spoke as someone used to carrying the weight of lives. Then came the financials. Janet walked forward with a folder of her articles and supporting documents. She had already published the story in the Dallas Morning News, and the copies sat in the judge's hands. She spoke of Carter Soft accounts used to pay for Cancun, of the attempted sale agreement with Vanessa listed as interim CEO of donation records to the church drawn from company funds. She explained how patterns emerged, each one pointing to deliberate misuse. Vanessa's attorney tried to paint it as misunderstanding, as stress in the wake of illness, but Janet held firm. She repeated dates, account numbers, amounts, her voice steady and precise. Pastor Michael followed. He looked older, wearier than when I last saw him at the pulpit. He admitted the church had accepted donations from Vanessa that raised her profile as a selfless widow. He admitted that he had praised her publicly, unaware the funds came from company accounts. His voice cracked as he said the congregation felt deceived. His eyes met mine briefly with something like apology. When it was Vanessa's turn, she stood and her mask cracked almost instantly. She raised her voice, accusing me of manipulation, accusing Caroline of lying, accusing Janet of inventing stories. She called the entire courtroom a conspiracy, a plot to strip her of what Daniel wanted for her. The judge let her speak for a while, then asked for evidence. She produced nothing beyond her words. Her attorney tried to reel her back, but the fury spilled out uncontrolled. She accused Daniel's memory of betraying her, said he had been confused, said he had loved her above all. Her voice echoed in the high ceiling until even her own lawyer sat silent. Rob rose calmly and reminded the court that evidence, not emotion, was the standard. He reviewed the chain one last time. The 2016 deed, the forged will, the Cancun receipts and boarding passes, the attempted sale agreement, the medical testimony. He spoke of Ethan, the child caught in the middle who deserved stability and truth, not spectacle. The judge sat quiet for a long moment, eyes moving between the stacks of documents and the trembling figure of Vanessa at her table. Then he spoke. The April 2023 will is declared invalid, the signature proven false, the notary commission compromised, the witnesses unreliable. Title to the Austin property rests with Evelyn Carter under the 2016 deed. The assets of Carter Soft remain part of the estate to be managed under Evelyn Carter's authority as surviving joint tenant. Custody of Ethan Carter is granted to his grandmother with visitation rights for Vanessa Moore, supervised and limited. The gavel struck once. The sound rang through the courtroom like a bell. I closed my eyes and felt tears rise, not from grief this time, but from relief so sharp it left me breathless. Caroline's hand found mine. Janet's pen stilled on her pad. Rob exhaled softly, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Vanessa collapsed into her chair, her sobs raw and unpracticed now. The pearls at her neck shifted as she shook. The mask was gone. The room emptied slowly, people whispering as they passed. I stayed seated until the clerk gathered the last papers. Then I rose, clutching the binder against my chest. Outside the courthouse, the sky had cleared pale blue after the storm. I breathed in the cold air and felt the weight of months lift just slightly. The fight was not over, but the law had spoken. For the first time since Daniel's whisper in that hospital bed, I felt that his truth had found its way into the light. The day after court, I drove back to the house in Austin with Ethan in the seat behind me. He leaned his forehead against the window, watching the field slide by his small backpack, pressed against his chest. I had worried he would be restless, but he stayed quiet, eyes wide, as if he too understood something had shifted. When we pulled into the driveway, the roses along the fence were bare from winter, but the porch swing still creaked the way it always had. I unlocked the door and the smell of cedar and dust greeted us. It felt like Daniel's presence lingered in the walls, waiting for us to return. Ethan ran from room to room, his laughter echoing against the empty spaces. He stopped at the window in the living room and pressed his palm against the glass. "Grandma, this is where I waved to you," he said softly. My throat tightened. I crouched beside him and promised he would never have to wave from behind curtains again. That night we ate grilled cheese sandwiches on mismatched plates and sat on the living room floor because the dining table was still covered in boxes. Ethan leaned against me, his hair warm against my arm, and I felt the weight of months begin to lift. Sleep came easier in that house, though I woke once and walked through the dark rooms listening. It felt like the silence was finally mine. In the weeks that followed, life began to reshape itself. Carter Soft survived the storm, though scarred. Rob guided me through the legal filings, transferring authority, properly freezing accounts that had been compromised and establishing safeguards. Caroline traveled up on weekends, helping create order out of chaos. She spoke with staff, hired an outside accountant, and sat with me late into the night, sketching out budgets. For the first time since Daniel's illness, the company was not a burden, but a legacy. Janet published the full story in the Dallas Morning News. The headline carried weight. Fraud, forgery, and betrayal, the fall of a perfect widow. The article laid out every detail from the stolen notary stamp to the Cancun trip paid for with company funds. She included the community's reaction, the shift in the church, once the truth surfaced. Pastor Michael delivered a sermon of apology, acknowledging the congregation had been deceived, that they had praised a woman who had worn grief like a mask, while stealing from the very family she claimed to love. He asked for my forgiveness, and though my heart was still raw, I told him forgiveness would come in time. The neighbors who once whispered pity when Vanessa painted me as overbearing now crossed the street to bring casseroles and welcome Ethan. One afternoon, Mrs. Allen, who had shaken her head at me months earlier, pressed a pie into my hands and said she was sorry for ever doubting. I told her it was behind us. Her eyes watered as she hugged me. As for Vanessa, she disappeared from Dallas almost overnight. The visitation rights she had been granted she never used. Rumors drifted back that she had moved to Arizona with Jason Miller, but soon even he was gone from her side. The gym let him go quietly, tired of the whispers in the press. Without Carter Soft's money and without the church's adoration, Vanessa faded into a shadow. Ethan adjusted more quickly than I expected. He played in the yard, made friends at his new school, and sat at the kitchen table drawing pictures of houses and gardens. Sometimes at night he would ask about his father, his small voice breaking when he whispered why. I held him close and told him his father had loved him beyond measure, that love does not vanish even when people do. He would nod and fall asleep with his hand curled around mine. Spring came, and with it new roses on the fence. I painted the porch swing bright blue the way Daniel once said he wanted, and planted marigolds along the walkway. The house breathed again. I cooked Sunday dinners, inviting Caroline and Rob, sometimes Janet. We filled the rooms with conversation and laughter, and Ethan learned that family can be chosen as much as it is inherited. One evening, I stood in the doorway of Daniel's old office, now tidied and reorganized, and felt peace settle into my bones. The whiteboard he once leaned against the wall was gone, replaced by shelves with books and framed photos. I touched the edge of his desk and whispered that we had made it. The lies had crumbled. The truth had held. As I sat on the porch swing that night with Ethan curled beside me, fireflies flickered in the yard. I thought of Vanessa's voice in the rain telling me I had 3 days to disappear. I looked at the house, at the child beside me, at the steady pulse of life rebuilt, and knew the truth had reversed every word. I said softly into the evening air, you gave me 3 days to disappear, but the truth gave you no place to stay. This story is not just mine. It belongs to every mother who has been silenced, to every family torn apart by betrayal, to anyone who has been told they do not matter. If you have walked with me through these chapters, I ask you to share what you felt, to tell me what part of this journey stayed with you. Leave a comment, let your voice join mine, and subscribe if you want to hear more stories where truth and justice rise in the end. Together we can hold on to the power of family, of love, and of truth that never disappears.